Welcome to today's webinar, the IEP, What Every Educator Needs to Know to Promote Progress. Today's webinar is hosted by the Progress Center, an Office of Special Education Programs, or OSEP, funded center that's aimed at promoting progress for students with disabilities. Today's webinar will be recorded and posted on the center's website, which is www.promotingprogress.org. Live captioning is also available for today's webinar. All participants will be muted throughout the presentation. However, you may submit a question at any time into the question pod on your right-hand side. When you open it up, it looks just like the image shown here. For technical questions or if you have technical issues, a webinar team member will try to assist you as soon as possible. For content-related questions, we will be having a Q&A session at the end of today's presentation. So please submit as many questions as you have, and we will share them across our presenters as time allows. So my name is Dr. Tessie Bailey, and I'm the director of the Progress Center. And I'm excited about the Progress Center. We provide information, resources, tools, and technical assistance to support local educators in developing and implementing high-quality educational programs that enable children with disabilities to make progress and meet challenging goals. To support local educators, we share guidance, tools, resources that are based on existing research, state and federal law and policy, as well as local experiences. As part of our year 2 work, we've begun selecting partner sites where we will be working with them closely to develop their knowledge, skills, and infrastructure to support promoting progress of students with disabilities. So I want to just give a little bit of background. The center was developed in response to the Andrew F. decision that was handed down by the Supreme Court in 2017. And that decision states that an IEP must be reasonably calculated to enable a child to make progress appropriate in light of the child's circumstances. Under IDEA, the Individual Education Program, which we will commonly refer to as the IEP in this webinar, serves as the foundation for promoting progress for students with disabilities. Now, we know that a well-designed IEP ensures that students have access, or not alone, ensures that they have access to special education, related services, supplementary aids and services, and we use that to make sure they're accessing and benefiting from high quality core programming. But we also know that there's this necessary component around implementation, right? And today's webinar is really going to be focusing on the IEP and the 7 essential components that are required under IDEA. And this will be a jumping off point for a lot of our additional trainings, webinars, and resources that we will be developing to support local educators in creating the IEP, as well as implementing the IEP by well-qualified educators. And we know that that combination of development and implementation is really critical for promoting progress. Now, as I mentioned, I'm Dr. Tessie Rose Bailey, and I'm serving as the director of the center, and I'm also a principal consultant here at the American Institutes for Research. And I would also like to introduce my colleague, Shaylyn Quinn. She will be helping today in co-hosting this webinar. She'll be delivering a lot of the content that will be shared today. And you'll be hearing more from her in a little bit. And now that we've introduced ourselves, what we'd like to do is give you a chance to introduce yourself. And what we'd like you to do is take a moment and respond to the poll question. And it's really about what your role is as you're joining us today. Now, when you see that the poll opens, there will only be 5 choices. Either you're serving as a parent, a special educator, a general educator, an administrator, and then there is a 5th column for other. Now, we know there's some service providers and other folks on the call, but there are some limitations within this platform that we only have 5 choices. So please use the chat box to let us know what other role you're serving in. So I'm hoping folks can see that. All right, and I will just have to ask somebody if you can share the results for me because I can see it very tiny. All right, so I can see it. So I see about 40% of you are serving in a special educator role, and about 25% of you are in the administrator role. And I think that makes a lot of sense because we often think about the primary participants of the IEP or the development of the IEP as the special educator and the LEA who's supporting that. But we also know there's a lot of other team members. So we do see some parents who are critical partners, as well as folks who are serving in a number of other roles, including service providers, counselors, advocates who will be participating in an IEP. So we're really pleased to have you all here. We will continue to reinforce that the IEP is a team development decision, right? It's not necessarily just the special educator or just the administrator who's developing it. It's the team collectively who's developing the actual document as well as supporting the implementation. So our objectives today are pretty simple. We're going to explain how the IEP provides the foundation for promoting progress for students with disabilities. Some of us may sort of think about the IEP as a compliance requirement or something we have to do. But the intent of the IEP is to really help us think about the program that's going to be provided to the student that's likely to produce the benefits in light of the child's circumstances. Now we're going to review the essential requirements of the IEP, and if you have a lot of experience with it, some of this may be very familiar, but there are 7 essential requirements that make up the IEP, regardless of the state that you're located in, and so Shaylyn's going to share a bit about each of those. Now, just to give you a little bit about the Progress Center, our goal is around focusing on promoting progress for students with disabilities. And we do that through the development and implementation of a high-quality educational programming, not necessarily just the development of the IEP, but the programming that goes with that. And so for most students with disabilities, this does begin with the development of an IEP that's reasonably calculated to enable a child to make progress, right? And so it's not just putting the document together, but it's putting together a meaningful document. Now, today's webinar will focus on the development of that IEP, but we also want to know that, or make sure that when we develop the IEP, it can be implemented as designed within a supportive learning environment by well-trained teachers. So as I mentioned earlier, future webinars and resources will focus on this particular aspect. But today we're really going to focus on breaking down what's necessary for us to have a compliant and a substantively appropriate IEP. Now, in special education, we do use a lot of acronyms, and we're going to try to be very careful about that. You will see IDEA. It's one of the most frequently used, I think, special ed terms after IEP. And when we talk about IDEA, what we're talking about is our primary source of law for special education, law, policies, and procedures. It outlines what we are expected to do as educators, either as a teacher or an administrator. Now, IDEA stands for the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. So there's the key term of individuals, and it's really around providing a robust education. Now, the primary purpose of the Act is to ensure that students receive free, appropriate public education in the least restrictive environment through the IEP. So we're going to start with that IEP, which will include also where the student is being provided their supports to ensure that we are providing FAPE or free appropriate public education. Now, the IEP by law is a written statement for each child with a disability that is developed, reviewed, and revised on an annual basis. And it must include 7 essential requirements that are listed within the IDEA regs. Now, there is not a federal template, right, for what an IEP should look like. And so most folks depend on their state departments of education to provide some guidance about what it would look like within their particular state. Now, as a federal law, as I mentioned, all states must adhere, and their districts and their schools must adhere to the minimum requirements set forth in the Act. Now, a state and a district can actually go above and beyond what's required within IDEA, but many states may add some additional features or requirements, for example, shortening a timeline or adding an additional required member. So it's really important as you listen to today's webinar to also know that you need to check with your state education website to see if there are any additional rules or procedures that you must follow. And as I mentioned, today we'll focus on those minimum essential requirements. We're going to get back to the IEP basics so that we can help folks really understand where do we start this process. So I'm going to pass this over to my colleague Shaylyn, who's going to walk us through what are those 7 components.
Thank you, Tessie, and thank you again to everyone for joining us today. As Tessie mentioned, there are 7 requirements that must be included in every IEP that is developed, reviewed, and revised by an IEP team. So today we'll kind of walk through each of those requirements separately. In future webinars included in this series, we'll actually look a little bit more closely at each of these requirements and kind of talk about how each requirement can and should promote progress through the development and implementation of the IEP. So we'll also be sharing our tip sheets throughout this webinar to kind of help you to develop and implement IEPs with fidelity. And so some of you may notice that the transition plan is not included on this graphic as a required component. And this is because the transition plan, which includes transition services and addresses students' transfer of rights at the age of majority, only apply to the IEP to be in effect when the child turns 16. However, some of you may be in a state that has lowered the age to 14. So for some immediate resources to support the development of the transition plan that supplements the IEP, we recommend visiting the National Technical Assistance Center on Transition, and we'll put that link in the chat box. Future resources and webinars that come through the Progress Center, those will address this component of the IEP development implementation at a later date. And so before we jump into this first requirement, I'll just reiterate about that image on the right side of the screen of the tip sheet. And as I mentioned, Progress Center has developed a series of tip sheets that align with the requirements of an IEP according to IDEA. So for example, this tip sheet here focuses on what IDEA outlines for PLAS statements and it provides some tips for development with that ultimate goal of progress for students with disabilities. And so we'll put that link in the chat box. We recommend that as we kind of continue to move through the webinar that you open up the attached tip sheets and follow along with us. So this first requirement, present levels of academic achievement and functional performance, sometimes referred to as the PLAF statement or most commonly referred to as the PLAF statement. And I think it's important to note that IDEA does not just say present levels of academic achievement, but includes functional performance here. So both of those pieces must be included in the PLAF statement, regardless of a student's disability or areas of need. Functional performance generally refers to activities that are not considered academic or related to a child's academic achievement. So some of these functional performance type skills would include, but are not limited to, dressing, eating, social skills, mobility, and so on. We can click to the next slide here. So although, as Tessie mentioned, there's no federal template and IDEA regulations do not specify a particular structure of the PLAF, the IEP team can begin the process of developing a high-quality PLAF statement by focusing on 4 essential elements. So you'll see those here: student needs, effect on progress in general education, baseline information, and connection to goals and/or services. So on the tip sheet, you'll notice each of the 4 essential elements listed in the table with an associated icon and a short description, along with some associated guiding questions that can be utilized by an IEP team. So for example, the PLAF element baseline information, that refers to collection of baseline data that can be used for monitoring student progress, and it can give the IEP team an idea of where the student is currently performing in that moment of time. So some questions the IEP team might consider related to this element include, are the data being reviewed to determine whether the student is making progress specific? Are they objective, measurable, something that can be collected frequently? And do these data relate to identified areas of concern and state content standards? So these are all questions that can contribute to really robust discussion among an IEP team and can contribute to a high-quality PLAF statement. And ultimately, a high-quality PLAF statement serves as a foundation upon which the remainder of the IEP is built. And once you have that PLAF statement constructed, it can then be used to inform and develop the next requirement of the IEP, the Measurable Annual Goals, otherwise referred to as MAGs, more acronyms for you. According to IDEA, the MAGs must be designed to both meet the child's needs that result from the child's disability, to enable the child to be involved and make progress in the general education curriculum, and meet each of the child's other educational needs that result from the child's disability. A technically sound measurable goal should include each of the essential elements that are highlighted here in accordance with the tip sheet. So first you have condition, and that's the context or environment in which the target behavior is to be exhibited and measured. Then you have the target behavior itself, which is the academic or functional skill to be changed. And lastly, those two interrelated pieces there, the level of proficiency and timeline. The level of proficiency would be the level of performance at which the IEP team can determine that a student has achieved the goal. And then the timeline would be the period within which the student can be expected to meet the performance criteria. A tip for progress: technically sound goals should be written to ensure that students can make progress in light of their circumstances, and they should be written in a clear and concise way that allows all stakeholders who are participating in that IEP process, whether that's general education teachers or parents, to be able to understand and access the goals. So this is the essential function of the IEP, and it allows the student to make academic and functional advancement. Once an IEP team has outlined those measurable annual goals for a child's IEP, they must determine and describe how the child's progress toward meeting those goals will be measured. IDEA adds that this description must also indicate when periodic reports on the progress that the child is making will be provided to parents. And as specified here in IDEA regulations, these progress reports are to be concurrent with the issuance of report cards, so they're not just serving as a replacement. And when developing a monitoring plan for progress on the child's measurable annual goals, there are several practices outlined on our tip sheet here that are to be considered and several to be avoided. So IEP teams should consider expectations of frequent and systematic data collection, and it should be carried out by an individual with the appropriate data collection training, whether that's a teacher or a school psychologist. Teams should also consider the performance criteria from the annual goals and incorporate those in the monitoring plan. So for example, the plan may state that the student will perform a task with 85% accuracy during 3 out of 5 observations. Conversely, IEP teams should avoid using subjective measures to document progress and should avoid being too broad in descriptions of the setting or context. So just simply documenting that the observation occurred in the general education setting doesn't sufficiently capture the complexity of that environment. Finally, avoid collecting data on an inconsistent basis. So data collection should not just be done at a teacher's convenience, and it should not only be done when a student is in a good mood. Kind of think about the different data that you may collect on a student on Monday morning at the beginning of a reading class as compared to Wednesday right before recess. Ultimately, the best practice is to use formative assessments to measure progress on the academic skill or functional behavior specified in the annual goal, to allow for instructional decision-making and to give the IEP team time to make adjustments to the student's IEP when the student is not making progress. As we get into the next requirement of the IEP, you really start to see the interconnectedness and critical importance of each requirement. So the PLAF informs the development of the MAGs and the subsequent monitoring of progress toward meeting those MAGs. And then with all of this in mind, the IEP team must then consider and describe the necessary specially designed instruction, aids, and services that a student may need to advance toward meeting those goals and to be able to access and make progress in the general education curriculum. So the emphasis of this requirement is to provide special education aids and services that allow a student to be educated and participate with other children with disabilities and non-disabled children in the least restrictive way possible. So circling back to the top part of the slide, you'll see that this is to be accomplished through a statement of the special education and related services and supplementary aids and services based on peer-reviewed research to the extent practicable to be provided to the child or on behalf of the child, and a statement of the program modifications or supports for school personnel. So a lot of different kinds of aids and services there, each of those bolded on the slide. So let's just take a moment to talk about what each of these entails. Special education is specially designed instruction offered at no cost to the parents that meets the unique needs of a student with a disability in the areas of academics, functional and behavioral skills, and/or secondary transition. So special education is more intensive and individualized instruction than is typically provided in the general education classroom. Related services are supportive services necessary for that student to benefit from special education services. So some examples of related services might include transportation, psychological services, speech language therapy, or occupational therapy, to name a few. Supplementary aids and services are accommodations or modifications that allow the student to access both education-related and non-academic school-related activities with non-disabled children to the maximum extent appropriate. So an example of this area might be extended time on tests, and that allows the child to otherwise participate in the general education classroom with the added accommodation of some extra time to take the test that other students in the general education classroom may not require. And this definition here includes both accommodations and modifications, so I think it's worth making a distinction. An accommodation is an adaptation or change to the education environment that helps students overcome challenges presented by their disabilities to allow them to access the same instructional opportunities as students without disabilities. Modifications, on the other hand, they fundamentally alter or modify the content or curricular expectations in question, but with that same aim of allowing a student with disabilities to access the general education curriculum. Lastly, program modifications and supports for school personnel. Those are supports provided to school personnel to assist them in helping a student achieve his or her annual goals and to be involved in a general education classroom. So examples of this would include perhaps training on special equipment, adaptations to general education classrooms, or maybe specialized training for general education teachers. The fifth requirement in IDEA regulations includes an explanation of the extent, if any, to which the child will not participate with non-disabled children in the regular class and in the activities outlined in the Statement of Special Education Aids and Services. So notice the language here. It's very intentional because it says, explain the extent to which the child will not participate with non-disabled children. And so this forces the IEP team to justify any decision that removes the student from the general education environment to ensure that it's only happening when absolutely necessary. The requirement stems from one of the central tenets mentioned by Tessie earlier, upon which IDEA is built, and that's least restrictive environment, also referred to as LRE. IDEA also requires that the IEP include a statement of any individual appropriate accommodations that are necessary to measure the academic achievement and functional performance of the child on state and district-wide assessments. And if the IEP team decides that the child must take an alternate assessment instead of a particular regular or state or district-wide assessment, it must also include a statement of why the child cannot participate in the regular assessment and also why the particular alternate assessment selected would be appropriate for that child. And it's important to note that all students with disabilities should be included in educational accountability systems. Most students with disabilities participate in regular assessments similar to peers without disabilities, either with or without those added accommodations. A very small percentage of about 1 to 2% of students with significant cognitive disabilities may participate in a state or district alternate assessment based on alternate achievement standards. you can ask your state and/or local school district for a copy of their guidelines regarding the types of accommodations, modifications, and alternate assessments available to students. And as we discussed during our review of service delivery, accommodations change how students are tested, but do not change what a test measures. So some examples of testing accommodations include having the test read aloud, permitting scribes or dictation, or maybe testing in a small group setting. And that's also in addition to the accommodation we mentioned earlier, the extended time. So when selecting testing accommodations, it's important to note that they should be based on educational needs. They're not just a one-size-fits-all based on current placement or disability category. Selected testing accommodations should also be made available to the student for classroom summative assessments. And the actual selection process for both the testing accommodations and/or alternate assessments should always engage students and families in the decision-making to the extent possible. In this final requirement, IDEA outlines 4 essential elements to be considered and determined during the IEP development process. And those listed here: date, frequency, location, and duration. So the date refers to the date that the special education and related services identified in the IEP will begin. And that's with IDEA's instruction to, quote, start as soon as possible, end quote. Frequency refers to the number of times per week that the special education and related services will be delivered, while duration refers to the length of time of each of those sessions, which is often represented in minutes, of services to be provided to the student. And lastly, location, that is the placement where the services will be provided. And a tip for progress: in alignment with LRE, or least restrictive environment, inclusion in the general education setting must always be considered first and foremost as the presumed placement of every child with a disability. So how is it all connected? It's important to note that these 7 requirements do not follow a particular sequence, nor are they independent of each other. So the components of an IEP that are required by IDEA must fit together like puzzle pieces. You cannot have a complete compliant IEP without each of the puzzle pieces, and sometimes parts of one puzzle piece might be necessary to fill the gaps in a few others. So we must remember that the IEP is a living document and should be reviewed, tweaked, and modified according to a student's progress, despite best efforts to get it right the first time. Ultimately, the IEP team has that ability to develop and implement a critical piece of any high-quality educational programming that promotes progress for students with disabilities and contributes to their success. So as a center, Progress Center has developed a self-paced online module series that will align with the major IDEA requirements within the categories outlined in this graphic here. And these modules are meant to build teacher capacity to develop an IEP with fidelity. So toward the end of this webinar, we'll be sharing our social media handles and the newsletter sign-up link so that you can stay in the loop regarding the release of these modules very soon. And with that, we conclude our review of the 7 IDEA requirements regarding the development of a student's IEP. So I'll pass it back over to Tessie, and she'll speak a bit more on what IDEA requires in regard to the composition of the IEP team and kind of how these requirements, both for the development of the IEP and the IEP meeting process itself, have been impacted as a result of COVID-19.
Thanks, Shaylyn. And I want to just really highlight, and Shaylyn also mentioned this, is that all of these pieces fit together. And OSEP has made it very clear that not one piece is more important than the other. It's the collective of these 7 requirements that really allow us to build a foundation for a robust program. Now, we have a number of questions that are coming in, and I want to encourage you to put those in the chat box. I will say that if you use an acronym, sometimes it's a state level acronym. If you can clarify it for our folks reviewing those questions for the panel, just please write them out at least the first time so we can make sure that we interpret it correctly. Now, as Shaylyn mentioned, you know, all of this, I think the most critical piece of developing the IEP is that we are looking at it from a development, from a team perspective. And this is something that we've seen a little bit over time, maybe shifting a bit, that sometimes people defer to the special educator or defer to the school psychologist. And that is not the intent of IDEA. If you look at the list of IEP team members here on the left-hand side, you will see that the first 5 are bolded. Those are required members of every IEP team that collectively create this document with these 7 essential components. Now, in some cases, there may be the need for other individuals with knowledge or expertise about the child. And then in some cases, particularly as kids get older, we want to make sure that the child is also present at that IEP. Now, because we know this is essential for the development, we do have an upcoming webinar that we want to just share with you. And so if you will save the date, you'll also see a link in the chat box. But on March 16th, we will have folks from the National Parent Centers and some of our other Progress Center staff to really help you understand how does this team work together to really develop this IEP that is not just compliant, but is substantive, meaning it's giving us some substance so that we know when we implement it, we're likely to produce progress for this particular student. Now, what I'd like to do is just move us into a conversation around the impact of COVID. And this is going to be a little more less formal, I guess, a little less formal. And we'd like you to submit your questions as much as possible. But I do want to give you a sort of general sense about what we're seeing in terms of IEP development under COVID. As many of you know, as we closed physical buildings of schools, it was a big shift for us to try to figure out how we can manage the implementation of a current IEP, let alone write new IEPs. And in the spring of last year, many schools actually took a sort of dual IEP approach. They maintained the original IEP and then developed a supplemental IEP that was meant to be implemented under COVID. I think what often led to that is that we kind of thought this wasn't going to take a whole year or maybe 2 years, who knows how it's going to end. And we thought it was really a temporary fix while we would move back to the original development of the IEP. Now, we know that this is something we're in for the long run. And so OSEP has put out a number of sort of guidance resources that really get us to say, you know, we've got to start thinking about the kid, regardless of where they're getting their location of services, whether it's at home or hybrid or fully face-to-face. The IEP team's full responsibility is to still continue to make sure students have access to free, appropriate public education, meaning we can't use COVID as an excuse for why we're not doing something. Now, in the summer, there was a recommendations coming out that all IEPs needed to be reviewed in the fall and rewritten to be appropriate for the context of that particular environment. And so the main thing that you'll see is that first component is we know that the class have changed. The students' present levels of academic achievement and functional performance have definitely changed from when we may have written the original IEP in the summer or in the spring. In some cases, a student who may have made a lot of progress pre-COVID now has different types of needs or may have regressed in some ways. And so we have to really think about our development of the IEP under COVID as in real time. We can't look back at where kids were and try to get design our services about where they were. As Shaylyn mentioned, we need to be writing it as what they are in the present, right? That they're struggling with home instruction, or maybe the student's doing really well in home instruction. And we need to be clear about that within our present levels of academic performance and functional performance. And once we change the PLAF, it has a pretty significant impact on our goals. And so what may have been goals that were appropriate in the early, development of the IEP, where we're trying to look at, is COVID really going to go away? We now need to say, maybe those goals are different, right? We're on a completely different trajectory. But as long as those goals align with the current present levels of academic achievement and functional performance, then what we're doing is meeting the individual needs of the child in real time, right? Not what they used to be or not what they think they're going to be, but where they are in the present. And as Shaylyn mentioned, this is a living document. I think sometimes we've looked at the IEP as very static, where we write it in a year and we're stuck with what we wrote for the entire year. But the whole intent of that measuring progress over time is to give us an indicator of if what we initially designed, which we built upon our current understanding of the child's needs and the research, is really meeting the child at this time, right? Kids need change, their context change. So using that ongoing monitoring, that at least 4 times a year that supplements your progress or your report cards, can help us say, are these goals still appropriate given the students' present levels of performance? Now, what we don't want to do is have to rewrite the IEP on a regular basis. And that's why when we look at the components of the IEP, we write them in terms of needs, not particular programs or not particular specific places in which things occur, but look at the statement of specially designed instruction, the supplementary aids and services, and related services in terms of need. And then look at that 7th component about location of services, right? So we have these 2 pieces. What they need is what we outlined, and where those are occurring will be flexible given the current context. And so that's where we start to see the delivery of services. I think a lot of folks really struggled with trying to take the IEP that was designed for face-to-face and replicate it in a virtual setting. And that's not really what we're trying to do. Instead, what we're trying to do is meet the needs of the child. And if the child is in the virtual setting or in a hybrid setting, then we need to be designing the programming that's appropriate for that particular student. Progress monitoring, I just can't say enough about how critical it is in this particular context. You may have only been collecting and reporting progress every quarter or so, which is the minimum we see under IDEA, but we highly recommend that you're doing much more frequent progress monitoring, because what we're seeing is the needs of kids are changing much more rapidly than we've seen, right? Where their parent may have been employed last week and then they have some added stress at home, or maybe something clicked because they're getting a lot of support at home and they're moving quicker than we thought they were going to be. So that progress monitoring is really critical. And we know from some of our other national centers, people really struggled with how to do that. But I think the IEP, as Shaylyn mentioned, in developing the goals, if we think very strategically about what's the ultimate outcome, what are we trying to achieve, then we can think what is a realistic and feasible way to monitor that. That's not dependent, for example, on a particular location or a particular format of the delivery of services. We want kids to be successful regardless of where they're getting their support. Now, we recently, and I say recently, in the beginning of this school year, did a virtual IEP meeting webinar, and I highly recommend checking that out. I think you'll see the link in the chat box. But I think this is something that we're going to see has a standing impact, that the use of virtual IEP meetings we see can increase parental engagement, which is a procedural requirement of the development of the IEP. But it also allows us to be more flexible. If we're a service provider serving 4 schools, we can jump on at a different school and instead of having to physically be there. And so we see that that's actually a positive impact of COVID. A lot of parents really appreciate it. And it also allows the facilitator to better control the meeting, right? Because you can have a very clear agenda that's on the screen that everybody is attending to. This use of strategies to promote who's talking and who's going next, so that we ensure every voice is heard in the development of that IEP. Now, I want to just stop there, and I know we've received a couple of questions, and I want to respond to some of those, and then we'll continue to get them. But prior to the start of this webinar, we had some folks submit things, and there were some questions around, are there additional modifications and accommodations that are required in an IEP as a result of COVID? There is nothing that requires you to include something in an IEP that is not unique to the student, right? So you can't have all kids in special education must get this accommodation or must get this modification. That's predetermination. When we think about an IEP, it must be based on the individual unique needs of a child, not their disability label, not the context in which they're being educated, but on their PLAS. So if your PLAS statement says something that maybe this kid was disproportionately affected because of COVID or has an emerging need because of COVID, then you may have some modifications and accommodation that are addressing COVID-related issues for this particular student, but you wouldn't see that consistently across all sites. In terms of goal writing, I will say that there are two really fabulous resources that came out from the National Center on Intensive Intervention. And as Shaylyn mentioned, there is a tip sheet as well as some learning modules coming out about how do we write academic goals and functional goals. And something that we've seen in our training that we provided over the last 10 years, that the more confident we can become as teachers in terms of a template, right, in the way that we write it, it allows us to focus more on the content of the goal versus the structure of the goal. It's kind of like if you're teaching writing to kids, you know, they get really hung up on the number of sentences that need to be in the paragraph versus the quality of the paragraph. And by teaching them a strategy or an approach to write that, it allows them to focus less on the template or the structure of it, which you'll see in those resources, and instead focus on the substance of it. And that really is the most important thing. It's what we heard in the Andrew decision in 2017, is that we really need to be thinking about developing appropriately ambitious goals for students with disabilities. We also had some questions from service providers, and I really want to thank you all for attending. And as you noticed in that fifth component around the statement of special education and related services, supplementary aids and services as well, related services are a critical piece of this. Too often we've done the development of the IEP with service providers in a sort of fragmented way, right? Where the service provider sends their stuff and we show it in the IEP. Shaylyn made a really important statement at the beginning that everything that's in the PLAS, whether it's from the related service provider or the special ed teacher or the parents, must really align, right? It's not that we're just putting it in there for procedural purposes. It's that it's aligning with the rest of the pieces of the IEP. So I think about the components that we talked about, they also apply to occupational therapists and speech and language therapists, is that if there is an OT goal or a speech goal, there has to be a plaque that justifies that goal. And if there's a goal, then there has to be a direct connection to the related services that are being offered to the student, right? They're not, there's really this very clear through line with the related services as well as the SDI or specially designed instruction being provided to the student. So those are some that we got prior to, and I want to just open it up and see if there are some questions from our panel right now that we can try to help address as much as possible. Shaylyn?
Yes, I think, Tessie, you've covered a lot of the questions that we've been receiving in the chat box. We do have an outstanding question regarding the absence of a team of trained persons to diagnose children with special educational needs and what can be done to help those students.
Yeah, and when you say help those students, I guess the question I would have is help them become eligible, or these are students who are not yet eligible who we are trying to support. Either way, as we're sort of maybe getting some clarification, I would say that if you remember back to, I think, the statement of specially designed or special education related services, there is a fourth piece of that that Shaylyn mentioned, which is around support for personnel. So the other three pieces of that, related services, supplementary aids and services, and special education, are to train to support the student directly. Now, in order for us to have, as you mentioned, trained personnel to do these things, what we can do is use that fourth part of the statement to include in the IEP access to training for teachers, additional resources, going to conferences that help build the capacity of educators to be more trained, right? The knowledge and the skills to support individual students. So that's just something I would say, what should we do? We should really leverage that part. Parent training is an also underutilized piece, but if you think about, particularly under COVID, parents are now becoming a critical piece of the education support. So we can use that as a way to provide parent training so that they are feeling more comfortable as being a partner in the learning. So hopefully that helped. I think, you know, one of the things about the Progress Center is our focus is on the development of the high quality educational programming for already eligible students. But we want to make sure, right, that we're getting the right students. And part of that is, you know, the child find requirements. Do we have screening measures like your MTSS or your early childhood screening approaches that allow us to identify who may be at risk and then provide those validated interventions at tier 2 and more intensive interventions at tier 3. If you feel like that's a part of your system that's lacking, I highly recommend checking out the National Center on Intensive Intervention. They're also developing a robust set of learning modules. There's already self-paced modules and course content to help build the capacity for the delivery of that instruction so that teachers can say, this student's learning is very different than the majority of kids' learning, and this might be a child with a disability.
Great, and it looks like we have a few follow-up questions in regard to, mentioning the parent aspect of advocacy, and what should a parent know to adequately advocate for their child in an IEP meeting?
Yeah, I think a really important part, and we stressed this in the virtual IEP meeting webinar in September, is how it's going to run. And I think parents should inquire prior to, like, what's the structure of this meeting? What's the best way for me to provide supports? I think when parents don't know that, they often become passive participants of the meeting, and their voice may not really be heard. In that webinar, what we found is that parents found having the agenda prior to that address these components, right? Like, we're going to start off with the plaques, and this is what it is. We're going to start off, or then move to the goals. It allowed the parent to be more prepared to ask questions around that particular component. And it sort of facilitated a much more collaborative meeting. Every state, and we can put this in the chat box too, has at least one parent training center that can help build your capacity about the role of parents. We have collaboratively worked with the National Parent Center, the SIPR, around what is the role of parents, or how can parents be active participants in the IEP meeting. And I think that's where we're building our collective knowledge, not just the educator knowledge, but also the parent knowledge and service provider, to really work as a team to develop this program that we're working on.
Right. And I know that we will be digging into the measurable annual goals in future webinars and our self-paced modules, but given some time here, we did receive a question about how do we get at reasonably ambitious MAGs? Is there more information other than NDREF to assist with this interpretation?
Yes. Well, and I'll, just like anything in IDEA, there's always like a clarifier, like even when it says, based on peer-reviewed research, to the extent practicable, right? And that's because we know kids with very specialized, unique needs may not necessarily show up in benchmarking tests or in the evidence or research studies because of the uniqueness of that. But the National Center on Intensive Intervention has put out, I think, are two really good resources around some ways to think about developing appropriately ambitious goals. One of those is really identifying the benchmarks that a typically developing kid is using. I mean, in the ideal world, what we're trying to do is provide this specially designed instruction, the related services, the supplementary aids and services, so the student can achieve similar levels of success as their non-disabled peers. And so that's really where we start. There are two other options within the academic one that say, well, maybe the benchmark is unrealistic. This kid is 4 grade levels behind, but what we're trying to do is at least have comparable growth. So we can use a rate of improvement, and the resource that's available outlines the formula, right, how to do that. And it does require us to use standardized rates of improvement. You can get those from almost any tool these days, a progress monitoring or a screening tool, but it allows us then to have an authentic conversation about why this is an ambitious goal. The kid is still expected to make the same growth as their peers, although not necessarily at this point in time meet the same expectation, right? Because the expectation is really high, but we don't want to increase the gap over time. We want to be closing. There is also a more modified goal approach, setting approach, particularly for academics, that looks at an individual rate of improvement. So if you're working with kids with very significant disabilities and there's not published norms or the discrepancy is so significant, you can actually say, look, based on previous performance, progress monitoring under the previous IEP, the student was making this level of growth. And for us to be ambitious, we want to make more than that previous growth, right? So that's where it becomes very individualized for the student, but so it would be appropriately ambitious in light of that child's circumstances.
And a follow-up question from the same attendee who had the question about the MAGs, where is comparable growth information?
So you can actually get some of that on the National Center on Intensive Intervention website for some measures. I will say Intervention Central has some of those for things like math or early numeracy or writing. So if you're looking for that, but on the NCII website, there are national norms for rate of improvement for literacy. But if you do purchase a tool that includes like a screening or a progress monitoring tool that you're using either just for special ed or for school-wide, most of those systems now have embedded benchmarks and growth rates. And if you have a tool and you don't know where to find it, you can ask the publisher, but you can also send us a question and we can help you find that information as well.
Wonderful. Well, you've taken care of all of our questions. If you have any additional questions for the chat, to enter now.
Good. Well, we want to thank you all. We have about 5 minutes and we'll look at the chat box. I see that you'll see there's the Hasbrook and Tyndall from 2017. A lot of those benchmarks and growth rates are available for free, right? And I want to just say, you know, for us to provide specially designed instruction, we don't have to purchase something. Really what we're thinking about in the design of a high quality educational programming is, does it meet the unique needs of that child, right? So it could be delivered through a published program, a portion of a published program, or a teacher created program, as long as it aligns with those unique needs and there's evidence that this is going to meet those needs.
And one last question, just before we move on to our, it's in relation to this as well. How can a parent access your information? And so I think you can kind of get into the access of our information right now.
Yeah, so that's a perfect, we didn't set that question in there, so I appreciate you asking that. What you will see, we are very active. We are a new center. And so one of the biggest things that we recommend is that you sign up for our newsletter that will keep you up to date as things come out. Our learning modules are coming out, as Shaylyn mentioned. We have a full webinar series that's going to dive into each of these components. We have a number of national experts. We have educators and residents, so actual practitioners in the field who are helping us shape the information that we develop and share out with local educators. So a good way to stay up to date is just access our newsletter, and you can see the link in the chat box. I also recommend joining us on either Facebook or Twitter at our K-12 progress. It's the best way to get real-time information about what's happening and get some tips for how we can keep the momentum moving for improving progress for students with disabilities. We always appreciate your feedback. And so please, there'll be a link in the chat box. This is our first opportunity to share out this information, and we want to make sure that it's relevant. And we know that we have different levels of need. Some folks need a very high level need of just give me the basics. And we also know that there are folks who need a much more deeper understanding. And so you will see additional resources coming out to address that need as well. And so stay up to date with our newsletter, and please complete the survey and provide us your feedback or other information you might be interested in. And thanks in advance, and we'd like to thank you for sharing your Thursday with us, and we look forward to seeing you in our future webinars or our courses.